My name is Dale Schlichting, Dale Norman Schlichting, and he wanted my name, my age. I was born August 15th, 1933, so I'm 81 right now. And let's see, was that everything? Okay.
Where were you born?
Oh, where? Madison, Wisconsin. East, I think it was East Hospital. I can't remember. I wasn't reading well those days.
What did your parents do?
Well, my mother was a housewife, and my dad worked, I believe, as a bookkeeper, I think. I'm not real sure. He died in a car accident when I was 2, so I have no memories of him at all. But I think he was a bookkeeper. And at the time I died, or at the time he died, I didn't. He owned and had owned for about 2 weeks a tavern in downtown Madison, Wisconsin. From what I know of my father, I think he's probably pretty good at it.
So when you went into the military, were you drafted or did you enlist?
No, I beat the draft board. In fact, I never even saw a draft board until I'd been in the Navy for 3 years, 8 months, and 24 days. I turned 17 on August 15th in 1950. I enlisted on August 16th. Kind of interesting because the chief that was recruiting me, I actually went in, I recruited him, but anyway, the officer, a bunch of guys sitting there at desks and whatnot, and he asked me my age, and he's 17, and he said, "When's your birthday?" "Yesterday." And several of the guys said, "17, right?" "Yeah." And then there was a lot of snickering and laughing. "Yeah, school's ready to start next month." Then he asked me how far I got in school, and I said I graduated in June, and abrupt end of laughter. Then they gave me the universal dumbbell test, and I aced it with no problem. I never did have a problem with those. And they began to take me seriously about that time. I wound up, they wanted me to take the Eddy test, which is for electronics. And I went ahead and I said, "Okay, I'll take it." And I said, "Well, we'll schedule you in. We'll call you and tell you." So I went home and waited, and all of a sudden the phone rang one day, and it wasn't too long later. And they told me to come in on a certain date, whatever it was, I don't know. And I went to my old high school physics teacher, old Doc Raisin, one of the best teacher I ever had in high school. And he gave me a couple of books to think about and a couple to recommend from the library. So I went and studied, came back and took the Eddy test, and then he said, "Well, we'll call you when we're ready for you." So I said, "Well, all right. I want to go in, but I don't know what's going to happen." So I went off, took off and left, and it must have been about, September 20th, I think. The phone rang and, "Come in tomorrow morning and take the train to Great Lakes." And so this was, let's see, it was a Wednesday, yeah. So that must have been September 20th, and the 21st was a Thursday, and that was the day I went in the Navy. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of my life up to that point.
So why did you choose the Navy?
Because I grew up in a neighborhood, World War II, where everybody around me that went in the military went in the Navy, so I just kind of took it for granted. The Navy's where you go. So I went in the Navy. And the fact that the Korean War had begun back on June 20th or 25th, 24th, I can't remember the exact date, but, it went miles over my head. So, okay, so there's a war, big deal. And that was it. I just went in because the Navy is where people in my neighborhood were expected to go.
When you were enlisting, you didn't necessarily think like, "Oh, I might get stationed where there's a war," or what?
I didn't cross my mind to worry about it. I figured if there's a war, there's a war. I mean, I grew up in that environment. So the war was only 5 years behind me, and I never really thought that much about it. 17, big mature 17 years and 1 day old, you don't think that far. So I just went where I thought I was expected to go. And I had an uncle that had served in the Navy on an LST, and Navy must be the right place. So that's where I went.
So then after training, where were you stationed?
Beg your pardon?
After training, then where were you stationed?
Oh, well, training lasted quite a while, as it turned out. They were taking all the warm bodies they could get and shipping them out to sea. And 120 men in the company, there were only 3 of us who weren't guaranteed. I didn't know anything about this guaranteed stuff, but I could have had a guarantee and go on to ET school. There were 3 of us that managed to get into school, and I was one of them. And I wanted to go into aviation, and they sent me down to the Airman Prep School in Memphis. 8 weeks there. Then I spent another 5 weeks in mess cooking. And from mess cooking, they sent me to AT school, got an aviation electronics technician. And I went there for 29 weeks, I think it was. It was 28 weeks, but I had 1 week when I had to have a little minor surgery, but it threw me off by a week. So 29 weeks later, I finished with that and went from there. They ranked us in class. I wanted to be a radioman, gunner. Well, I didn't realize that a tail gunner is a mobile target. The first thing, if there is such a thing as a gunner, the first thing whoever it is wants to get you, first thing they look for is get rid of the stinger in the back. So there's an invitation on you that says, hey, here's the head under my head. That's what you want to hit. Well, they were wiping out the radioman school. So those of us who went through there want to be radiomen, go for radiomen, but nobody was getting any rating. So I got out of there, and from there they sent me to Norfolk, and they had the final 6 weeks of school at Norfolk. It happened to fall over Christmas, so I got my first leave in, 16 months. After I went in the Navy, I got my first leave, so I went home for Christmas and came back on New Year's Eve and finished off that, and they were sent me from there to Florida. And I think I was the only man in the class that did not request to go to Sanford, Florida. Guess where I went? Sanford, Florida. I wound up in Attack Squadron 35, which was ADs. Guys who have been around the naval aviation know what the AD is. Most other people won't know, or they'll know from the Vietnam War. It's the only propeller aircraft that was still being used in the Vietnam War because it was such a good aircraft, and it was. It was a sweetheart. And I loved working on that. Made a med cruise, came back, and it was all set to make a round the world cruise. And the government decided, well, the Korean War is ending. We don't really need all these people in uniform. We're going to cut 2 months off everybody's enlistment. And I was scheduled to be discharged the day before I turned 21, August 14th in 1954. So they backed me up to June 14th, 1954. And my squadron is going to be gone for 9 months all told, and they're going around the world the hard way. They're doing it through the Suez Canal and down, and coming down through the, Panama Canal. Well, they told me I couldn't go because I wasn't due back until August, I think it was 8th, which would have been, with a week to spare. Wonderful. No, you got to be let go 2 months early. That's what it says here in Bupers, whatever. So I went in and argued as much as a little, at that time, third class, can't argue much with Lieutenant J.G. And he said, no, the only way you can make this cruise with us is you've got to extend. I said, well, I don't mind. I'll put in the regular 2 months. I'll just do my original enlistment. No, we have to extend you from your original date. When would I get out? You'd get out August 14th, 1955. I said, hold it. I've got me a wife-to-be waiting. We got the church all set up at St. Pat's, and I'm nuts about this little girl, and no, we can't do it. Well, they wound up, Lieutenant J.G. carried a whole lot more weight than a third-class petty officer. So he got his way, and I was left behind. I think there were 13 or 14 of us that were left behind who were due to be discharged earlier than we'd planned on. So the end result was I got married to my little honey. Lasted 52 years, and then she decided she'd leave me, and she died. So anyways, that was pretty much my whole naval career. The best thing I can say for it, aside from the fact that I love the Navy, was that I found my sweetheart. It was a squadron party, and they were having a beach party, and my buddy Nick was dating a local girl in Jacksonville, and she had a girlfriend that came and visited her once in a while from Gainesville, where she was going to school, University of Florida. Well, here she was going to show up on this Saturday, and they had no date for her, and I didn't have a date. I didn't need one. So they started working on me. Hey, how about just this one time? Nah, I don't want to. I got a girlfriend back in Milwaukee, so what do I care? Well, they kept working on me. Finally, I said, okay, to heck with it. I'll go ahead and I'll date her and bring her on. And they brought her on. And 5 minutes after I started talking to her on the beach, and once I found out which one she was, we got to the beach, and the only way I could recognize her when she came out of the women's bathhouse was I gave her my blanket and my portable radio. I looked on the beach. I couldn't even remember exactly what she looked like. So I looked for my blanket. She had my name in the corner. And yeah, that's my blanket, and that's my radio. And this must be the famous and ever popular Rachel that everybody's trying to date off. So I settled down, said hi. 5 minutes later, I went fanny over tea kettle, and I never got over her. It was the nicest thing the Navy ever did for me, was getting me this blind date. Anyhow, that's the story of my Navy career.
Where were you stationed?
Well, I first went to the squadron. It was in Sanford, Florida. That was in January 17th of 1952. And Sanford was heaven on earth for a Navy enlisted man. We could wear civvies on and off the base, which was quite unusual at the time. And I found a woman, I hitchhiked over to Daytona Beach with a man and wife, and they had a daughter living in town, and she had a son about my age. He was graduating from high school. I mean, I graduated so darn young at 16 that he could still be there a year and a half later, and I was still floating around in that milieu. So anyhow, introduced me to her daughter and Durward and their family and friends, and next thing you know, I was running with a high school crowd. Big old 18-and-a-half-year-old mature sailor. But anyhow, I got settled in with them, made friends with Durward, and just enjoyed life. It was a dream location. Sanford, Florida at that time was not near the town it is now. It was much smaller. But they had a little zoo and a lake, and they were the celery capital of the world. Whoopee. And I liked life there very much. Liked it real well. Well, we left August 15th for a med cruise. I spent 6 months in Europe at the government's expense. And I had a good time at that, enjoyed myself again immensely. I had a wonderful experience on Christmas Eve. They let us go to midnight mass on shore. So I said, well, sure, I'll take that. So I went ashore, and it was when I turned my life around, because I was so impressed with the fact that here I was with all these French people in a church, no pews, but it was in Marseille, which is one of the sin capitals of the world. I didn't know that at the time. Being young and silly, I didn't know a lot of things. And here I was standing in this church, which was cold, and we were having the exact same Mass there in Latin that I had had back home. And that's when I really turned me around. And gee whiz, all these people, we got this in common, so common that we're standing here freezing for the love of Christ. And I'm not a, what you would call, I'm not sure what you'd call me. But anyhow, I wasn't a holy, but I was very impressed with, gosh, we have this in common. We're all sharing this. And I've carried that feeling with me to this day, as a matter of fact. And it moved me. I came back from there, and we were stationed at, what is the name of the field? I can't remember the name of the field anymore, on the west edge of Jacksonville. It's now in the city, but it's a civilian airstrip. But anyhow, we were stationed there, and that's where we got the word that we were going to cut enlistments 2 months. And then I argued with people at several levels for whatever it was worth. But that's where I spent the Korean War, was in the Atlantic and on the east coast of Florida in Jacksonville. I married my honey December 5th, 1953. And 6 months later, June 14th, I was discharged. End of Navy history.
What kind of duties did you perform that were like support roles for the war?
Okay, I was an electronics technician working on the AD. I was in Squadron, Attack Squadron 35, VA 35. It doesn't exist anymore. They wiped them out. But the AD was a lot of fun to talk about because these Army people weren't sure. They thought the only aircraft involved in the war were the Corsair, which aircraft I really loved, and the P-51. And P-51 I loved, but it was an Army aircraft, so it doesn't. But once I explained which one the AD was, it was the big, lagging, slow, ugly warlord. It could carry. We bragged up on it. One of them had officially carried 22,000 pounds of payload. One aircraft, one engine. But for normal use, it was rated, I think, at 9,000 or 10,000 pounds. But it was real good. It lasted clear into the Vietnam War. And they were still using it. The Air Force calls it the A-1. And we had the Navy terminology, which made it the AD, the attack aircraft, D for Douglas. It was the same aircraft, and the Air Force found it wonderful for loitering. You send the troops in there, and the troops want some air support. Boom, send in some ADs, and it would just loiter slowly. They could typically loiter for about 8 to 10 hours. So you got a lot of service out of them. And it was the last propeller aircraft as a conventional piston engine aircraft. Last one to make it all the way through into the 1970s. Anyhow, it was a nice aircraft to work on. It was foul to work on in that your only access in electronics was to crawl under the plane, look up. It had a flat bottom. You had a hellhole with a couple of Zeus buttons. So you open the Zeus buttons, pop open, and climb up in, and there you were inside it, which on a Florida flight line was real pleasant. Sun beating down, and you got a dark blue aircraft body, and here you are up in there working. But anyways, it was good for loitering missions, ground support, and Corsair was the aircraft that most of these Army people liked. Well, the Corsair was a beautiful aircraft. It looked beautiful. It's hell to work on, but it was beautiful to look at. And I found out today from one of the Army people that I was one of the few people who seemed to know why it was built with that funny inverted gull wing. Because if you built it without the gull wing, you'd fire up the engine and the propeller would scrape the ground. So the only purpose for the inverted gull wing was to get the axis of the. Well, I'm an engineer. Trying to think, how can anyhow, to get the propeller up a little bit higher so it wouldn't quite touch the flight deck. But that's what I worked on.